The dishes are done. The television is on. Two people move through the same rooms with the practiced ease of long familiarity, filling glasses, checking phones, saying the small things that need saying about tomorrow's schedule. Nothing is raised. Nothing is demanded. The subject that consumed 3 months of accusation and retreat has simply vanished from the permissible air between them, and in its absence there is something that feels on the surface almost like relief, almost like peace. But if you watch the way each person moves slightly away when the other sits down, the way questions stay at the logistical edge of things, the way no one laughs at something that would have made both of them laugh 2 years ago, a different question surfaces beneath the quiet. The fighting stopped. That is real. What is less certain is whether anything else began. Introduction. There is a difference between the end of visible conflict and the beginning of repair, and that difference is not always obvious in the first days of calm. When fighting stops, something genuine does change. The ambient tension of anticipating the next argument drops. Sleep returns. Conversations about groceries and appointments become manageable again. None of that is false. The observable reduction is real, and for many relationships it marks the beginning of something better. But observable calm is not the same as relational healing, and the mistake of treating one as the other has its own long consequences. Quiet can emerge from several different mechanisms, and each one produces a surface that looks almost identical from the outside. Two people may stop arguing because they reached understanding, worked through what divided them, and no longer carry the unresolved weight. Two people may also stop arguing because one or both of them became too tired to continue. They may stop because speaking began to feel dangerous. They may stop because one of them has already left the relationship inwardly, even while remaining physically present. The same calm room can be evidence of any one of these conditions, and the room itself will not tell you which. This is what the quiet register addresses. It is a way of reading what remains after the volume drops, a set of tests applied not to the argument itself, but to the relational territory the argument was circling. The tests concern acknowledgement, responsiveness, access to truth, and behavioral evidence over time. They do not require reopening every wound or resuming every conflict. What they require is honesty about what the silence contains. The central question this examination will carry through every chapter is this: when the fighting stops, what evidence proves that the relationship healed rather than merely became quiet? Chapter 1. What the end of fighting proves. The first thing worth noting is that the reduction in conflict is an actual, measurable event. Fewer arguments, fewer hostile messages sent at midnight, fewer conversations that begin in one room and escalate through 3 others before ending without resolution. The frequency goes down, sometimes to 0, and this registers in the body before the mind has time to interpret it. The chest is less tight. The morning feels less loaded. The shared space feels navigable in a way it did not during the height of things. That physiological shift is not nothing, and it would be dishonest to minimize it. For many people, this reduction arrives after a long period of genuine attrition, and the relief it brings is proportionate to how exhausted the conflict had made them. A marriage that spent 2 years cycling through the same unresolved argument and the same failed reconciliation will experience the stopping as a kind of weather change, almost as dramatic as the conflict itself. That relief, even when it is complicated, is information about how much the conflict had cost. It is worth treating seriously rather than dismissing as naive. Observable calm has real value. A relationship that managed to reduce its most damaging patterns, regardless of what produced that reduction, has changed one concrete feature of how its members treat each other. Behavioral change at the surface is still behavioral change, and sometimes it creates the conditions under which deeper repair becomes possible. It would be an error to assume that any quiet relationship is automatically worse than a conflicted one. Frequent arguing is not evidence of passion or health. Its reduction is not evidence of defeat. What the reduction does not prove, however, is what caused it. The argument column in the register reaching 0 is a fact about behavior, not a fact about the relationship's condition. A column can reach 0 through resolution. It can also reach 0 through exhaustion, through fear, through the strategic decision to stop engaging with something too costly. or through the quiet withdrawal of the person who has simply stopped caring enough to fight. The number looks identical in all 5 cases. Separating behavioral reduction from emotional repair requires distinguishing between 2 questions that the relief of silence tends to collapse into one. The first question is whether the damaging behavior stopped. The second question is whether the underlying relational damage was addressed. In a marriage where one partner repeatedly dismissed the other's concerns about money, the arguments may stop when both people stop raising the subject. But if neither person asked what the dismissal meant to the other, or what changed afterward, the financial disagreement was the surface. The relational meaning beneath it, that one person did not feel taken seriously, remains exactly where it was. In a workplace partnership that went through months of tension over divided responsibilities, the visible conflict may end when both people develop parallel systems that require less communication. The arguments disappear because the overlap that generated them was eliminated. But if the trust that was damaged during the dispute was never named or rebuilt, the 2 people are now operating in proximity without actually depending on each other. The silence is functional. The partnership in any meaningful sense has already contracted. When the argument column reaches 0, the productive question is not whether to celebrate or worry. It is to ask what the 0 represents. That question cannot be answered by watching the surface. It requires looking at the mechanisms that produced the change, because each mechanism carries a different prognosis and calls for a different response. The first mechanism is resolution. In a resolved reduction, the people involved named the rupture, understood what it meant to each of them, took responsibility where responsibility belonged, made changes to their conduct, and allowed trust to rebuild through evidence over time. The quiet that follows genuine resolution feels different from the inside. There is a kind of settled quality to it, a sense that the subject is not forbidden, but simply no longer governing the relationship. If the topic were raised again, it could be discussed. The resolution did not require pretending the conflict never happened. It required that what happened be honestly processed. The second mechanism is exhaustion. When the same argument has been attempted many times without producing anything useful, the people involved may stop initiating it simply because they no longer have the energy to absorb the cost. Nothing was resolved. The original wound was not named. Its meaning was not acknowledged. Behavior did not change. What changed was the capacity to fight about it. Exhausted quiet is not hostile in the way active conflict is, but it carries its own weight. The topic does not feel resolved. It feels dangerous and inaccessible, like something both people have agreed without quite saying so to carry separately. The third mechanism is fear. Some people stop raising difficult subjects because previous attempts resulted in consequences severe enough that the risk no longer feels worth taking. That fear may concern emotional escalation. It may concern practical retaliation. In certain situations, it may concern physical safety. When silence is produced by fear, the quiet surface is misleading in a particular way, because it can read as compliance or acceptance when it is actually the elimination of the speaking person from the conversation. Whatever that relationship appears to be on the surface, its content has been made inaccessible. The fourth mechanism is strategic withdrawal. This is distinct from exhaustion in that it is more deliberate. A person practicing strategic withdrawal has assessed the conflict, concluded that engaging directly does not serve their interests, and chosen to redirect their energy. They may continue to invest in the relationship in other ways. They may not. What has changed is that they have removed this particular subject from the negotiation table, not because it no longer matters to them, but because they have decided that the table cannot hold it. The fifth mechanism is emotional departure. A person who has departed emotionally may remain physically present in every meaningful sense, living in the same home, attending the same events, maintaining the same logistical arrangements. What has withdrawn is their investment in the relationship's future. The quiet this produces is often the most stable because there is no longer enough internal stake to generate the friction that conflict requires. It can look for a sustained period almost exactly like peace. Each of these mechanisms produces the same observable surface and a different relational reality. Knowing that fighting stopped is useful information. Knowing why it stopped and what relational condition the silence reflects is the work that the register was designed to do. The taxonomy of quiet that comes next is the first instrument in that diagnostic process, because not all silence calls for the same response, and reading them as identical leads to decisions made without adequate information. Chapter 2. 4 Kinds of Quiet. Restorative quiet is what follows acknowledgement and genuine repair. It is a silence that does not require vigilance to maintain, because the reason for conflict has been addressed rather than bypassed. When a couple has worked honestly through a serious rupture, there is a period afterward that can feel almost surprising in its quality. Not euphoric, not the absence of all difficulty, but genuinely different from the silence that preceded the conflict. The tension that once occupied the space between two people is no longer there, because whatever was generating it has been named and responded to. Warmth can return in this kind of quiet. So can ordinary humor, small curiosity, the instinct to share something that happened during the day. The distinguishing feature of restorative quiet is not the absence of topics, but their accessibility. A subject that generated months of conflict may be raised again, and while it may not be entirely comfortable, it does not feel like detonating something. Both people know that the subject can be spoken without the conversation immediately departing from safety. That knowledge changes how people move in the shared space. The reduced vigilance is visible in small ways: less careful positioning, more willingness to be in the same room without an agenda, less monitoring of the other person's emotional temperature before deciding whether to speak. Exhausted quiet shares almost no visible features with restorative quiet, but its surface can look similar. When the same argument has been attempted repeatedly, without either resolution or meaningful acknowledgement, something in both people eventually stops trying to breach the wall. The energy required to re-enter that conflict one more time exceeds what they have available, and the topic simply stops appearing. But the issue has not changed. The original meaning of the rupture, whatever it was about reliability or loyalty, or the sense of being taken seriously, remains as alive and as painful as it was before the exhaustion set in. It simply no longer reaches the surface. The distinguishing marker between restorative and exhausted quiet is the difference between reduced tension and reduced investment. In restorative quiet, the warmth that was present before the conflict begins to return, gradually and unevenly, but in a recognizable direction. In exhausted quiet, the warmth that was present before the conflict does not return. What returns is the ability to occupy the same space without immediate friction, which is a different and much more limited kind of peace. Curiosity about the other person tends to diminish rather than revive. Small gestures of connection are made out of habit rather than genuine interest. When the topic that caused the conflict is gently referenced in a restorative quiet, both people can acknowledge it without immediately escalating. In exhausted quiet, the same gentle reference tends to produce one of two responses: a rapid deflection that signals unwillingness to re-enter the territory, or a brief, flat acknowledgement that does not go anywhere. Neither of these is necessarily evidence of bad faith. They are evidence that the topic remains unresolved and that the resolution has not yet occurred, even if the argument has stopped. One practical test involves what happens when something related to the original rupture occurs. If a couple had a prolonged conflict about financial decisions and one of them subsequently faces a financial difficulty, does the other person's response reflect the repair that was supposed to have happened? Or does the same dynamic that generated the original conflict reassert itself, with the same dismissiveness or the same unilateral action, simply in a lower volume? The presence of restorative quiet can usually survive contact with the original subject matter. Exhausted quiet, when it meets the same subject matter again, tends to reveal that nothing has actually changed. The two are also distinguishable through the affect that accompanies small daily interactions. In restorative quiet, people who were previously in serious conflict begin to recover something of what they genuinely appreciated in each other. In exhausted quiet, the interactions remain predominantly functional and somewhat careful. There is nothing hostile in it, but there is also nothing interested. The relationship is operating at a reduced bandwidth, and the reduction is not a temporary rest. It is a new operating level. Fearful quiet arises when raising a subject has become associated with a consequence severe enough to make the speaking seem not worth the risk. That consequence may be emotional, a pattern of escalation that reliably makes the speaking person feel worse than if they had said nothing at all. It may be relational, a history in which raising a concern results in punishment through withdrawal, hostility, or the weaponization of other vulnerabilities. In some situations, it may be physical, or may carry practical consequences such as financial retaliation or damage to shared family arrangements. The range is wide, and the response it requires varies significantly depending on what kind of consequence is involved. Departed quiet is produced by something different. A person who has emotionally departed from a relationship has not necessarily withdrawn out of fear. They have withdrawn because the investment that once made the relationship feel worth fighting for has been exhausted or has gradually dissolved. The relationship continues to exist in its practical form. Shared duties are carried out, social appearances are maintained, but the internal experience of the relationship, the sense of being in genuine contact with another person who matters to you and to whom you matter, is no longer present, or is present only in residual traces. The surface behavior of fearful and departed quiet can look similar: minimal conflict, reduced emotional disclosure, careful management of what is said and what is not. The internal experience that produces each is very different. A person in fearful quiet is often highly vigilant. They monitor the other person's emotional state, calibrate their own communication, and carry a persistent awareness of what cannot be said. A person who has departed emotionally often carries none of that vigilance, not because safety has returned, but because the stake has been removed. The monitoring stops when the caring stops. Grief and indifference are the emotional tones that distinguish the two, and neither of them is easy to read in another person. A person afraid to speak may appear calm, even agreeable, in ways that mask considerable internal tension. A person who has departed may appear similarly calm, without the tension beneath it. The distinction matters practically because the responses these two states call for are different. Fearful quiet asks whether safety can be restored. Departed quiet asks whether investment can be recovered. Safety is not a metaphor in this context. When silence is produced by fear of physical harm, or by the kind of systematic emotional pressure that makes a person uncertain about their own perceptions, the diagnostic framework here is not a sufficient response. Professional support, including counseling, legal guidance, or safety planning, may be necessary before any attempt at relational repair makes sense. The register can identify the presence of fearful quiet. It cannot substitute for the professional assessment that some situations require. Avoiding forced confrontation is a specific caution when fearful quiet is possible. The impulse to open a difficult conversation because the framework suggests it may be helpful is not always an appropriate guide. Some conversations require conditions of safety that the relationship does not yet provide, and pressing toward disclosure in the absence of those conditions can increase rather than reduce harm. The register is a diagnostic tool, not a mandate for immediate action in every case. What fearful and departed quiet share is that neither represents a healed relationship. Both require honest naming before any genuine repair can be attempted. The difference between the two shapes what an honest response looks like, which is why the taxonomy matters. The question beneath the question is, beneath this quiet, what is still present and what has already left? The rupture that the silence is concealing is the subject of what follows. Chapter 3. The unresolved rupture. Some ruptures are discrete, a single event, a betrayal of confidence, a broken agreement with serious consequences, a public humiliation, a decision made unilaterally about something the other person considered shared, constitutes a before and after moment in the relationship. People often experience these events as a kind of internal seam. There is the relationship as it existed before this thing happened, and the relationship as it exists now, with this thing inside it. The event does not need to be dramatic or publicly legible to function this way. What makes it a rupture is the shift in expectation it produces, the revision it forces of what this relationship means and what can be counted on within it. Other ruptures are cumulative. They are not produced by a single event, but by a pattern of events whose individual instances may each appear relatively minor. Repeated dismissal of concerns, consistently choosing a different priority when conflict arises between two loyalties. Small promises that are broken often enough to constitute a reliable pattern rather than isolated failures. Each instance taken separately might be absorbed. Taken together, they produce something structurally similar to a discrete rupture. The expectation of being reliably considered, or reliably chosen, or reliably believed is no longer there. The relationship is operating on a revised understanding of what it offers. Both types alter expectations, and this is what separates them from ordinary conflict. Not all conflict produces rupture. Two people can have a serious argument about a significant subject and emerge from it with their fundamental expectations about each other intact, even if they remain unresolved on the subject matter. Rupture occurs when the conflict, whether it happened once or over many years, changed something about what a person can rely on, trust, expect, or safely bring into the relationship. The original argument may concern money, or a family decision, or a professional failure or an infidelity, but the rupture beneath it concerns the relational structure itself. Mature relational examples are useful here because they carry the texture of actual adult life. A spouse who unilaterally depleted a shared savings account to manage a private debt has done something that, on the surface, concerns money. What it touches beneath the surface is the shared framework of the marriage, the assumption that significant decisions affecting both people would be made together, the expectation of financial transparency, and the question of whether one person's private difficulty belongs to both of them or only to one. An adult child who shared a family confidence with extended relatives after agreeing not to has done something that, on the surface, concerns information. Beneath it, the rupture concerns whether this person can be trusted to hold something fragile. What the conflict was ostensibly about often functions as a container for a deeper disagreement that neither person has found words for. Two colleagues who argued at length about project attribution may have been circling a much older grievance about whether their contributions are equally visible and valued. A married couple arguing about how holidays are spent may be having a long-running negotiation about whose family, whose preferences, and ultimately whose experience takes precedence. The surface conflict identifies the location of the rupture. It rarely names its content precisely. Separating the conflict topic from the relational meaning it carries is the first act of honest diagnosis. Until the meaning is named, repair addresses the wrong level. The fighting may have been about the money, the holiday, the project credit, or the confidence. The wound is about something that the money, the holiday, the project credit, or the confidence was asked to carry. The next section of the register addresses exactly this translation. A conflict about money within a long-term relationship rarely remains purely about money once it reaches the level of rupture. What money decisions contain at the relational level is information about reliability. Whether this person makes commitments and keeps them, whether the shared framework of the partnership can be trusted to hold under pressure, whether a private crisis will be brought into the shared space for navigation or managed separately in ways that affect both people without their knowledge or agreement. When the argument stops and the subject is buried, what remains is not a disagreement about financial strategy. What remains is an unanswered question about whether this person can be depended upon when the circumstances are difficult. Family conflicts carry a different translation. When two partners argue at length about how to handle each other's families, whether the conflict concerns time, money, boundaries, or care, the relational meaning typically involves loyalty. The question being asked, often without being clearly stated, is, when there is a real conflict between my interests and your family's interests, which direction do you face? That question carries weight precisely because the answer, across multiple situations, tells both people something about the fundamental structure of the partnership. A person who feels consistently deprioritized in favor of their partner's family of origin does not merely have a disagreement about schedules. They have acquired evidence about where they stand. Emotional dismissal, the repeated experience of bringing something genuine and having it minimized, deflected, or treated as excessive, carries a meaning that concerns the safety of disclosure. A person who has been told several times in various ways that their emotional experience is disproportionate, inconvenient, or wrong, begins to revise their assessment of what can be brought into the relationship without cost. The content of what they were dismissed about matters less than the accumulated evidence about whether this space is safe for their internal experience. Once that safety has been called into question, it changes what a person chooses to bring and what they carry privately instead. Broken promises translate into questions about trust, which is related to reliability but distinct from it. Reliability is about consistent conduct over time. Trust is about what a person believes to be true about another's intentions and capacity. A promise that is broken once, acknowledged specifically, and genuinely repaired does relatively little damage to trust. A promise that is broken, apologized for without examination of why it was broken, and then broken again in similar circumstances, has demonstrated something about either capacity or intention, and the person who experienced the breakage will form a conclusion about which it was, whether or not they speak that conclusion aloud. These meanings do not always correspond between the two people involved in the rupture. The person who made the unilateral financial decision may understand the rupture primarily as a failure of communication under pressure, an episode in which they handled a difficult situation badly and for which they feel genuine regret. The person on the receiving end of that decision may experience the same event as evidence about whether their voice matters in the partnership. Both of these readings can be simultaneously true. The event was a failure of communication, and it produced evidence about whose experience is treated as primary. Repair requires that both readings be named, not that one be declared correct. The unresolved relational question, the one that the conflict was asking without reaching an answer, is usually somewhere in this territory. Can I rely on you? Do I matter to you in the way I thought? Is my experience real to you, or is it an inconvenience? These questions are rarely asked directly because their directness feels too vulnerable. They are asked instead through arguments about money, schedules, loyalty, and attribution, because those subjects feel more manageable to dispute. When the argument stops, the question does not disappear. It waits, underneath the silence, for an answer that the silence cannot provide. Chapter 4. The sentence that never arrived. Acknowledgement, in the sense that matters for relational repair, is the act of naming both the action that occurred and its impact on the person who received it. This is more specific than either an apology or an explanation. An explanation addresses what happened from the perspective of the person who did it and why it occurred. An apology names regret. Acknowledgement adds something that neither alone provides: the demonstration that the experience of the injured person has been genuinely received, that the impact on them is understood as real and is treated as having weight. Acknowledgement does not require identical interpretation. Two people can acknowledge the same event with different readings of intent, context, and cause, and both be telling the truth. What acknowledgement does require is that the experience of the person who was harmed not be reduced, contested, or made conditional on the other person's comfort with accepting responsibility. It is possible to say, "My understanding of what happened is different from yours, and I also recognize that the way this landed for you was genuinely painful, and that matters to me." Those two positions can coexist. Most real acknowledgement contains both. The place where acknowledgement fails most commonly is in the treatment of the facts. When the response to a rupture focuses primarily on factual precision, establishing exactly what was said, establishing what was intended, establishing what the speaker's version of events is, the impact on the injured person becomes something to be litigated rather than something to be heard. A person who experienced a partner's public dismissal of their concern as humiliating does not need a factual rebuttal of whether the dismissal was actually harsh or whether the public was paying attention. They need acknowledgement that the experience of being publicly dismissed was real and that it mattered. Factual minimization is the most common way that acknowledgement is replaced with something that looks like acknowledgement, but is not. A useful example involves a broken commitment around a significant event. One partner promised to be present for something the other person considered important, then chose a different priority without adequate warning or explanation. The conflict that followed may have been intense and long, but the sentence that the injured person needed, the one that acknowledgement would have delivered, was something like, "I made a commitment and I did not keep it, and I understand that being absent from that moment meant something beyond the practical inconvenience. I understand what it communicated about how I value your priorities." That sentence, or something close to it in honest substance, is what genuine acknowledgement would have required. Acknowledgement at this level is difficult, not because people are unwilling to feel regret, but because receiving the full weight of what an action communicated about the relationship requires a certain tolerance for discomfort. Accepting that what happened meant more than a logistical failure, that it communicated something about how the other person is valued or prioritized, can feel threatening in a way that simple regret does not. Simple regret requires owning the act. Full acknowledgement requires also owning the meaning the act carried. Including the speaker's own perspective does not invalidate this. In the broken commitment example, the person who was absent may have had genuine reasons for prioritizing differently in that moment, reasons that were real even if not adequately communicated. Acknowledgement does not require pretending those reasons did not exist. What it requires is that the presence of those reasons not be used to minimize the impact, not be offered as a way of reducing the weight of the event on the other person's experience. "I had reasons, and those reasons do not change what my absence communicated to you," are two sentences that can both be true, and saying both is more honest than saying only one. What the injured person was waiting to hear was not necessarily a verdict, not a formal admission of total wrongdoing, not a complete capitulation to their interpretation of events. What they were waiting to hear was evidence that their experience had genuinely landed on the other person, that the impact was real to the person who produced it, not a distortion, not an overreaction, not something to be argued down. The absence of that sentence, the one that would have demonstrated genuine reception, is what remains when the argument stops, but the repair has not occurred. There are 4 sentences that appear frequently in the space where acknowledgement belongs, and each of them deserves careful examination, because each contains a partial truth that makes it feel sufficient when it is not. The first is, "I already said I was sorry." This sentence performs 2 functions simultaneously. It references an act that was real, the apology that was offered, and it signals that the conversation should now be considered closed. The problem is not that the apology was insincere. Often it was not insincere. The problem is that an apology names regret without necessarily demonstrating understanding of the impact. When a person says they are sorry without naming what they are sorry for at the level of relational meaning, the injured person has received information about the speaker's emotional state, but not evidence that their own experience has been understood. The second sentence is, "Can we please stop talking about this?" This is sometimes offered as fatigue, and the fatigue is often genuine. Conflict is exhausting, and the desire to stop cycling through the same territory is understandable. But as a response to an injury that has not been adequately acknowledged, this sentence shifts the burden of the unresolved material from the person who produced the rupture to the person who was affected by it. It asks the injured person to carry the resolution by abandoning the need for acknowledgement in exchange for the other person's comfort. When this request is granted repeatedly, the injured person learns that raising the subject costs them more than it costs the person who caused the harm, which changes how safe it feels to bring things into the relationship. The third sentence is, "You did things too." This sentence is frequently accurate. Most relational ruptures occur within a context of mutual imperfection, and both people can usually identify conduct on both sides that was less than admirable. The sentence becomes a substitute for acknowledgement when it is used to establish equivalence at a moment when the conversation requires that one specific harm be named and received. It redirects the focus from the impact of a specific action to a general audit of the relationship's balance sheet, which is a different and much longer conversation. When used to avoid sitting with the specific weight of one person's experience, it forecloses the acknowledgement rather than contributing to it. The fourth sentence is, "That was not my intention." Like the others, This sentence is often true. Most people who cause relational harm were not intending to cause precisely the harm that was caused. Intention is real, and it matters. But intention does not determine impact, and the exclusive focus on intention can become a method of contesting whether the impact was real. When a person responds to an account of harm primarily by clarifying that they did not mean to cause it, the injured person hears, "The version of this event that matters is the one centered on my experience of causing it, not your experience of receiving it," which is another way of saying that their experience is secondary to the speaker's interpretation of the speaker's own conduct. Each of these sentences contains an element that could belong to genuine repair. Acknowledgement of having apologized, desire to move forward, recognition of mutual imperfection, and clarity about intention are all legitimate parts of an honest accounting. What they share when they function as substitutes rather than components is that each of them routes the conversation away from the specific impact of a specific action on a specific person. The repair sequence that follows addresses what comes next when those substitutes are set aside and the actual territory of the rupture is approached directly. Chapter 5. The repair sequence. Naming what happened is the first requirement, and it is more specific than it sounds. Not naming that there was a conflict, or that things became difficult, or that the relationship went through a hard period. Naming the action. Naming it in terms that reflect the other person's experience of it, as well as the speaker's. There is a practical discipline required here. The name has to be accurate enough that the person who was harmed recognizes their experience in it. If what occurred was that a significant financial decision was made without consultation, then naming a communication difficulty is not the same as naming what happened. The specificity of the name determines whether the acknowledgement can reach the level at which the rupture actually occurred. Understanding the relational meaning follows from the naming. This is where the translations examined earlier become necessary. Understanding that a broken commitment was experienced not primarily as a logistical problem, but as evidence about priority and value, means sitting with what the action communicated beyond its immediate content. This is not comfortable, and it is not quick. It requires the person accepting responsibility to stay with the other person's account of what the event meant long enough to actually receive it, rather than processing it quickly and moving on to repair before the understanding has fully arrived. Hurried understanding produces hollow repair. Identifying responsibility requires some care with proportionality. In most ruptures, responsibility is not entirely one-sided, but that is not a reason to distribute it equally by default or to make the conversation about responsibility before the injured person's experience has been received. The honest question is, what part of what happened was my conduct, my choice, or my failure to act when I could have? That question is different from, how did we both contribute to this situation? The second question may be relevant at some point, but it is not the first move when one person's specific conduct has caused specific harm. Proportionate repair means that what is offered corresponds to what was damaged. An apology is proportionate repair for minor slights. A missed birthday requires acknowledgement and a changed approach to similar situations in the future. A significant breach of trust, whether involving finances, loyalty, promises, or emotional safety, requires acknowledgement, genuine understanding of the meaning, changed conduct, and time. The person offering repair does not define what is proportionate. They can propose it, but the person who experienced the harm is better positioned to identify what would constitute meaningful repair, and asking them rather than assuming is itself part of the repair. Inviting correction is an act of genuine epistemic humility rather than a rhetorical gesture. When a person working through a rupture says explicitly that their account of what happened and what it meant may be incomplete and invites the other person to add to it or correct it, they are demonstrating that they understand the relational information matters more than their own version of events being confirmed. This invitation must survive being taken up. If the invitation is offered, and the other person does add something or correct something, and the response is defensiveness, the invitation was not genuine. What happens after the acknowledgement, the understanding, and the proportionate offering matters as much as the sequence itself. The conversation is not the repair. The conversation creates the conditions under which repair can begin. What actually repairs the relationship is whether the conduct that produced the rupture changes in a consistent and observable way across time and across situations that resemble the original one. Defining a behavior linked to the rupture is the first step in converting repair from a conversation into a process. If the rupture involved unilateral financial decisions, the linked behavior is how financial decisions are made from this point forward. If the rupture involved a betrayal of a shared confidence, the linked behavior is how private information is handled. If the rupture involved repeated dismissal of emotional experience, the linked behavior is how the other person's feelings are received in subsequent conversations. The repair behavior is not generic. It is derived directly from what was damaged. Creating observable change in that specific behavior constitutes the first evidence. The injured person can observe it. It is not solely a matter of internal intention or declared commitment. Something different happens in a situation that resembles the original rupture, and the person who caused the harm behaves differently in it. This first instance is meaningful but insufficient. Any behavior can be produced once under the heightened attention that follows a serious conversation. The question is whether it can be maintained when the heightened attention fades and normal life resumes. Repetition of the changed behavior across relevant situations over time is what converts an initial gesture into something that can carry trust. The financial partner who, after the rupture conversation, makes 3 subsequent significant decisions in transparent consultation with the other person, has produced more repair-relevant evidence than the most emotionally compelling apology. The evidence is not the conversation but the conduct, and not the conduct in one instance, but the pattern of conduct across multiple instances that resemble the original vulnerability. Trust characteristically lags behind conduct, and this is not a failure of the injured person. It is an appropriate response to having experienced a rupture. The body and mind of a person who has been harmed do not reset their expectations simply because the other person has begun behaving differently. They observe the new behavior with some caution, checking whether it holds. This lag is not a punishment. It is how trust is rebuilt through accumulated evidence that the changed conduct is not a temporary adjustment, but a genuine change in pattern. The person attempting repair who becomes frustrated with the lag is asking to be believed rather than demonstrating that they can be trusted, which are very different requests. Demanding quick forgiveness or treating the injured person's continued carefulness as ingratitude is one of the most reliable ways to undermine repair that has genuinely begun. A person who changes their conduct and then expects that the relationship immediately return to its previous condition has misunderstood the repair process. The change in conduct is what the injured person needs. Their trust is not something that can be demanded as a reward for the changed conduct. It arrives or does not arrive in proportion to the evidence, at the pace the injured person's system requires. Whether the new behavior survives, stress is perhaps the most diagnostic question in the entire repair process. Almost any change can be maintained under normal conditions. The conditions that resemble the original rupture, a financial pressure, a loyalty conflict, an emotional disclosure that challenges the listener, are the moments that reveal whether the change is structural or cosmetic. If the old pattern reappears under stress, the injured person has received important information about what the repair actually produced. That information is not a verdict about the relationship. It is data that belongs in the register. Chapter 6. When apology closes the conversation. Apologies offered during peak conflict carry a particular problem. When 2 people are at the height of an argument, the emotional pressure on both of them is severe, and the person who caused harm may offer an apology during that pressure, as much to reduce the immediate intensity as to genuinely address what happened. The apology may be entirely sincere in the sense of being felt. What it tends not to contain is the careful consideration of what happened, what it meant, and what would constitute meaningful repair, because the conditions for that consideration do not exist at the height of a conflict. The apology is real. Its adequacy is a different question. The expectation that follows such an apology is often for immediate closure, Having offered the apologizing person may feel genuinely and not cynically that the account is now settled. The conflict was painful. The apology has been offered. It seems reasonable to them that the relationship should now return to its previous condition. This expectation is often communicated, sometimes explicitly and sometimes through behavior. The conversation shifts to other subjects. Gestures of normalcy are made. The expectation that the injured person will meet these gestures is present in the room even when it is not stated. For the apologizing person, closure brings real relief. The conflict that made the shared space difficult is over. The acknowledgement, however incomplete, has been offered. The emotional weight of sitting with another person's pain diminishes when they accept the apology and the conversation ends. This relief is not malicious. It is a genuine experience of pressure releasing. What it does not contain is awareness of what the pressure's release costs the other person. The injured person, meanwhile, may be in a position where accepting the apology quickly is more socially and relationally safe than continuing to name their experience. If previous attempts to articulate the impact of the rupture resulted in escalation, defensive counter-accusation, or the accusation that they are dwelling unhealthily on the past, then accepting the apology becomes the rational short-term choice, even if it leaves the repair incomplete. The pressure on them is real. In accepting the apology, they are often not declaring that the repair is complete. They are choosing the available piece over the unavailable acknowledgement. Accepting an apology and restoring trust are not the same movement. A person can accept an apology genuinely while the trust that was damaged by the rupture remains unrestored, because the apology addressed regret but not the conduct or the meaning. This distinction matters practically. If both people treat the acceptance of an apology as the completion of repair, they will proceed on different assumptions. The apologizing person will believe that the matter is resolved. The injured person will carry the unresolved weight privately, because the social contract of having accepted the apology makes raising it again feel dishonest or punitive. The silence that follows may look like peace to one person while it is something quite different to the other. In the context of a repeated broken promise, the apology as exit pattern becomes particularly visible. If the same type of commitment is broken, apologized for and treated as resolved 3 or 4 times, the apology has been decoupled from the conduct it was supposed to address. Each individual apology may be genuine. The pattern, however, demonstrates that the apology is functioning as a way to end each episode of conflict, rather than as a step toward changing the behavior that makes the apology necessary. By the 4th instance, the injured person has learned that the apology is the shape the relationship has chosen for handling this particular failure, not a precursor to change. Emotionally impressive language at a moment of repair is not automatically evidence of insincerity, but it requires examination. A person who responds to a serious rupture with language that is beautiful, specific, emotionally rich, and moving may be expressing something they genuinely feel at depth. The question the register asks is not whether the language is performed, but whether the conduct that follows it corresponds to what the language promised. The eloquence of an acknowledgement is not evidence of its adequacy. Its adequacy is measured by what happens afterward. When a person looks at the eloquent language offered 6 months earlier and then looks at the conduct that followed it, the comparison often reveals a significant gap. The language named the rupture precisely. It described the impact with evident understanding. It promised specific changes. What followed in subsequent months was conduct that continued to resemble, in its essential patterns, what it had been before the rupture conversation. The words and the conduct diverged, and the divergence is the primary diagnostic information. Repeated recurrence of the pattern that generated the rupture, after a genuinely impressive apology, is evidence that something in the repair sequence was absent, even if everything in the language was present. Assuming deliberate manipulation in these cases is usually premature and frequently wrong. A person whose impressive apology is not followed by commensurate change may be entirely sincere in the moment of the apology and genuinely unable to maintain the change afterward. The question worth asking is whether the missing element is capacity, willingness, or structure. A person who lacks capacity to make the change has genuine limitations, perhaps in self-regulation, perhaps in the ability to recognize in the moment when the old pattern is reasserting itself, that makes sustained change difficult without support. A person who lacks willingness is making a choice, whether consciously or not. A person who lacks structure lacks the practical conditions, routines, or accountability that would make the change sustainable. The response to each of these is different. Missing capacity may benefit from external support, therapy, coaching, or other resources that develop specific skills. Missing willingness requires a different kind of conversation, one that examines what actually changes and what does not, and what that pattern means for the injured person's assessment of the relationship. Missing structure may be amenable to practical redesign, specific agreements with built-in accountability that make the changed behavior more likely to be maintained. Assigning all recurrence to manipulation skips this analysis and produces a conclusion that may be incorrect and that forecloses repair that might otherwise be possible. Evidence needed for repair, in the context of apology without change, consists of sustained behavioral difference in situations that resemble the original vulnerability, not the conversation, not the language, not the declared intention. The registered evidence is whether the behavior changed, whether the change held across multiple situations, and whether it held under the kinds of pressure that previously produced the original failure. This is not a harsh standard. It is the only standard that actually tells both people whether the repair reached the level at which the rupture occurred. Chapter 7. The Avoidance Agreement. Most relationships that have passed through a serious rupture without completing repair have a subject that has been removed from active conversation. It may not have been officially removed by agreement. The removal may have happened through accumulated experience. The growing awareness that raising this subject produces consequences neither person wants to manage again. Over time, both people develop a sensitivity to the moments when the conversation approaches that subject, and they develop habits of steering away from it, not necessarily through conscious coordination, but through individual responses to the same learned understanding. The cues that steer a conversation away from the forbidden subject are often subtle. A shift in topic that follows a phrase that rhymes with the forbidden territory. A brief expression that signals to the more attuned person in the room that this direction is not safe today. A practical question inserted at a moment of emotional approach, redirecting the conversation toward logistics and away from the relational meaning that was about to surface. Neither person may articulate any of this. Both people may be performing these maneuvers simultaneously, each believing themselves to be preventing an unnecessary conflict rather than collectively constructing an avoidance system. When both people understand that a particular conversation would escalate, they develop what functions as a shared prediction model. Both anticipate the trajectory of the conversation before it begins, and both prefer not to enter it again. This mutual anticipation is a form of relational intelligence operating in the service of short-term comfort. Its cost is that the subject whose repair would require entry into exactly that conversation remains permanently inaccessible. The cooperation that keeps the peace is the same cooperation that keeps the repair from happening. The practical surface of the relationship, meanwhile, remains functional. Two people maintaining a forbidden subject can manage a household, coordinate around children, complete shared professional duties, attend events together, and appear entirely cooperative to anyone observing from outside. The avoidance does not typically prevent the instrumental operations of the shared life. What it prevents is the relational operation, the honest exchange of experience, the naming of what has changed, the acknowledgement that the relationship is carrying something that has not been addressed. What honesty would threaten in these cases is the stability that both people have organized their lives around. The peace is fragile in a specific way. It depends on the subject not being named. The stability is real, but conditional. Both people know at some level that the peace is maintained by the avoidance rather than by the repair. Naming the subject would risk the peace. The calculation both people make, usually without discussing it, is that the risk is not worth the potential gain. This calculation can remain in place for a very long time, and the longer it remains, the more structurally embedded the avoidance becomes. The implicit bargain that maintains the avoidance system can be stated plainly, even if it is never stated between the people who operate within it. There will be no conflict, and in exchange there will be no truth. The truth here refers specifically to the unresolved relational meaning of the rupture, the honest account of what happened, what it changed, what remains unaddressed. Both people trade access to that truth for the preservation of the surface peace. The trade feels rational because the alternative, re-entering the conflict territory, seems to offer pain without guaranteed resolution. One person typically gains stability from this arrangement, a reliable environment in which the most threatening topic is not introduced, in which daily life can proceed with predictable interactions and no sudden escalation. This is not a trivial gain. For a person who experienced the conflict period as genuinely destabilizing, the return to predictability carries real value, and the avoidance system that provides it may feel worth maintaining even at the cost of relational honesty. The other person may be gaining temporary safety in the sense that the avoidance prevents further experiences of being dismissed, invalidated, or having their experience overridden. If previous attempts to address the rupture resulted in being told that their account was inaccurate, their feelings disproportionate, or their concerns unfair, then the avoidance system at least prevents additional instances of that specific harm. It is a defensive arrangement rather than a comfortable one, but it has its own logic when the alternative is re-entry into a conversation pattern that proved harmful. The long-term emotional cost falls differently on each person, but it falls. A relationship organized around a forbidden subject gradually loses its capacity for honest exchange in areas adjacent to that subject. The prohibition tends to expand because subjects that approach the forbidden territory through association become slightly dangerous too, and the avoidance habits extend to cover them. Over time, the range of honest conversation available in the relationship narrows in ways that may not be apparent in individual interactions, but that become visible when you look at the pattern across months or years. Assigning equal responsibility for this arrangement automatically would be inaccurate, and the register does not do so. The avoidance system is often the product of an asymmetry that was present before the bargain formed. If one person's response to the rupture conversation reliably made it more costly for the other person to continue than to retreat, the structure of the avoidance was shaped by that asymmetry. Both people participate in maintaining the bargain, but the conditions that made the bargain seem necessary may not be equally authored. Power differences and safety concerns are relevant here in ways that require explicit acknowledgement. When one person's participation in the avoidance system is not a preference but a necessary response to an environment they cannot safely exit or challenge, the analysis of mutual participation does not apply in the standard way. The bargain is not freely entered when one party has significantly less freedom of movement than the other. In those situations, the relevant question is not how to renegotiate the bargain, but what conditions would need to change before honest engagement becomes possible, and whether those conditions can be created safely. Chapter 8. The Cost of False Peace. The household functions, the schedule is maintained, the children are collected on time, the bills are handled, the dinners are produced, the appointments are kept. From the standpoint of anyone who depends on the relationship's practical output, everything appears to be working. The efficiency of the logistical operation is often remarkable. Two people who are no longer genuinely engaging with each other's internal experience can develop extraordinary coordination in the management of shared tasks, precisely because the tasks require no relational honesty. The task is either done or not done. That question at least has a clear answer. Curiosity is the first thing to disappear when a relationship becomes primarily logistical. Not the performance of interest, but the genuine impulse to know how the other person is experiencing their life. The question of what the other person actually thinks about something, what they are finding difficult, what they are hoping for, what they are quietly managing, stops presenting itself with the same urgency. The space that curiosity once occupied is filled by the coordination of tasks, and the efficiency of the task coordination can mask the absence of the curiosity for a considerable time, because the relationship still feels, from the outside and often from the inside, like it is functioning well. Communication narrows to the operational, not because either person decides to limit it, but because the subjects that lie beyond the operational are either forbidden or have atrophied through disuse. What is the plan for the weekend? Who is handling the quarterly report? When does the appointment need to be rescheduled? These are real questions about real shared responsibilities, and answering them efficiently feels like communication because it involves words passing between two people in a purposeful way. But operational communication is a subset of relational communication, not a substitute for it. A relationship in which all communication has become operational has lost the larger part of its informational range. Cooperation and connection are not the same, and the distinction matters. Two people can cooperate with high efficiency precisely when they have reduced their relationship to its logistical dimensions, because logistical operations do not require the vulnerability and negotiation that genuine connection involves. A relationship that mistakes high cooperation for genuine connection has made an error that will remain invisible until one of the people involved requires something beyond the logistical, something about being genuinely known, genuinely considered, genuinely present to, and discovers that the apparatus for providing it has been quietly dismantled. In a marriage with significant logistical obligations, children, financial arrangements, shared property, the logistical relationship can maintain its own weight for years without either person necessarily naming what has been lost. The same dynamic operates in family relationships with financial entanglement or caregiving obligations, and in long professional alliances where practical interdependence continues after the relational trust has contracted. In each case, the relationship's survival is ensured by the practical necessity of the cooperation, not by the health of the underlying connection. The emotional topics that are excluded from a logistical relationship are often precisely the ones that would be most relevant to the quality of the shared life. How a person is experiencing the weight of an obligation, whether the distribution of effort still feels fair, whether what they are contributing to the relationship matches what they are receiving from it, whether they still want to be doing this. These questions do not emerge naturally in conversations about the schedule. They require a kind of conversation that the logistical relationship has ceased to provide space for. When a relationship loses its honest informational exchange, both people begin substituting prediction for consultation. Instead of asking what the other person thinks or wants about a particular decision, one person develops an internal model of what the other person would say and acts on the model rather than the person. This is often rationalized as consideration, as knowing the other person well enough not to require constant consultation. What it actually reflects is an accommodation to the fact that genuine consultation is no longer available or no longer feels worth the relational cost. Hidden plans become a feature of this arrangement, not necessarily plans of betrayal, but plans developed privately that will have consequences for both people, which are introduced only at the point of implementation rather than in the stage of deliberation. A job change explored for months and revealed only when the decision is made. A significant purchase processed privately and presented as fact rather than possibility. A family arrangement modified without discussion and announced in terms that make reversal implausible. Each of these decisions may be entirely practical. What they share is the removal of the other person from the decision-making process, which is both a product of the avoidance system and a deepening of it. Consent in these circumstances becomes reduced, not eliminated, but reduced in scope and depth. Major decisions in a shared life that are made by one person and experienced by the other as facts, they must accommodate, represent a narrowing of the shared governance of the relationship, even when the decisions themselves are reasonable. The experience of being consulted, of having one's perspective genuinely sought and considered before a significant decision rather than after it, is a feature of a relationship where genuine contact is still occurring. Its consistent absence is one of the more concrete signs that the relationship has entered a parallel lives configuration. When prediction replaces information, assumptions accumulate. Each assumption is a small departure from the actual person, a substitution of the model for the reality. Over time, two people making decisions based on their models of each other, rather than actual consultation, can discover that the gap between the model and the person has grown considerably. The assumption that the other person does not want to discuss financial planning, based on their reluctance during the conflict period, may have hardened into a practice of excluding them from financial discussions, even as the underlying reluctance changed. The assumption becomes the operating reality, long after the evidence that supported it expired. Resentment and parallel lives are the structural results of this pattern sustained over time. Resentment builds not only from the original rupture, but from the accumulated experience of having one's preferences, concerns, and perspective consistently removed from consideration. Parallel lives emerge when each person's actual experience of their own desires, difficulties, and development is being processed privately rather than in the shared space. Two people living parallel lives in the same home are not necessarily in conflict. They are often in something quieter and more final. The delayed consequences of this pattern are among its most damaging features because the delay allows both people to continue misidentifying the arrangement as functional. The consequences tend to arrive at points of transition, when children leave, when a professional role ends, when a health challenge redistributes the practical load, when the logistical necessity that held the structure together is reduced or removed. At those points, the relationship that was maintained by shared tasks loses the tasks, and what remains is examined honestly, sometimes for the first time in years. That examination often reveals that the relationship contracted much earlier than either person was prepared to admit, and that the contraction was treated as peace. Chapter 9. Quiet that may be healthy. The register would be incomplete if it addressed only the forms of quiet that indicate unresolved damage. Some relationships become genuinely calmer over time, not because honest engagement has been abandoned, but because it has been consistently maintained and the acute difficulties have been genuinely worked through. Resolved quiet is the condition in which a previous rupture was acknowledged. Its relational meaning was understood by both people. Conduct changed in the relevant areas, and trust rebuilt through accumulated evidence. The quiet that follows this process is not the quiet of avoidance. It is the quiet of a conversation that has been completed. In resolved quiet, the behavior linked to the rupture has changed in observable ways that both people have registered. The changed behavior was not a single instance, but a pattern, and the pattern has held across situations that resembled the original vulnerability. Both people have had the experience of the new conduct functioning under pressure. That experience of the pattern holding is what converts changed behavior into evidence that supports revised trust. The quiet is not maintained by avoiding the subject. The subject simply no longer governs the relationship because the relational question it was asking has been answered. When an issue has been genuinely resolved, it remains discussable. This is the practical test. If the subject that generated the rupture were raised again, both people could engage with it without the conversation immediately reaching a dangerous intensity. There might be some discomfort. The history of the conflict may make the subject feel sensitive, but accessible is different from forbidden. A topic that is slightly sensitive and can still be entered is not the same as a topic that cannot be approached without significant risk. The accessibility of a formerly dangerous topic is evidence that the repair addressed the level at which the rupture occurred. Warmth and flexibility are present in resolved quiet in ways that distinguish it from logistical arrangements. Two people who have genuinely repaired a serious rupture often develop a greater rather than lesser tolerance for disagreement in other areas because they have demonstrated to each other that the relationship can survive honest conflict. This is counterintuitive but consistent. The experience of navigating a serious difficulty and coming through it with the relationship intact tends to increase confidence that future difficulties can also be navigated. The relationship becomes less brittle, not more. An issue no longer governing the relationship does not mean it is forgotten. It means that its weight has been redistributed. The relational question it was asking has received enough evidence of an answer that it no longer organizes both people's behavior around it. A financial rupture that was genuinely repaired may still be part of the shared history of the relationship, occasionally referenced perhaps with some residual tenderness. What it is no longer is the invisible weight in the room that both people are constantly managing around without naming. Intense relational work is genuinely exhausting, and the impulse to take a pause from it is not evidence of avoidance or bad faith. After a period of sustained honest engagement with a difficult rupture, both people may need time that is not dedicated to processing the rupture, time when the relationship is allowed to function in ordinary life without requiring constant attention to its repair. This is not the same as the permanent burial of an unresolved issue. It is the recognition that sustained engagement requires recovery, and that recovery requires periods of ordinary life. The key feature that distinguishes a healthy pause from avoidance is the existence of a return point. A deliberate pause acknowledges that the conversation or the process is not finished and establishes, at least implicitly, a sense of when re-engagement is appropriate. Both people understand that the pause is not closure. The subject remains accessible. The processing has not been declared complete. What has been established is a boundary around the intensity, a recognition that continuous active engagement is not required or sustainable, and that the relationship is allowed to breathe around the repair work without abandoning it. Safety and genuine consent matter in the way pauses are established. A pause that is proposed by one person and experienced by the other as compelled is not a mutual rest. The person for whom the pause feels compelled may be the one who most needs the repair conversation to continue, and their experience of being required to stop prematurely belongs in the register as information about the distribution of power within the negotiation. A genuine pause is one that both people can enter without one of them carrying the additional burden of having had their needs suppressed to enable the other person's comfort. Forced immediate processing is its own form of violence. Not every moment of difficulty needs to be examined immediately in conversation. Not every emotional reaction needs to be processed aloud before daily life can resume. The expectation that every relational development must be verbally processed immediately places an enormous burden on both people and can produce a kind of relational exhaustion that makes genuine engagement harder rather than easier. Some things take time to become clear internally before they can be brought into honest conversation. Honoring that time is not the same as avoiding the conversation. The line between a deliberate rest and an indefinite burial of an issue is drawn by whether the topic remains accessible after the rest. If two people take a month away from actively discussing a particular rupture and then find themselves unable to re-enter the subject without the same danger that was present before the pause was not a rest. The pause became the new form of the avoidance. The test is not the duration of the pause, but whether the ability to re-engage survives it. When it does, the pause was restorative. When it does not, the avoidance reconstituted itself in the form of a rest. There are situations in which the relational difficulty has reached a level of complexity, pain, or structural entanglement that the two people involved cannot navigate adequately without outside support. A professional who can hold the conversation with appropriate skill, provide the structure that prevents harmful escalation, and assist with the specific repair work required is sometimes not a last resort, but a first appropriate response. Seeking that support is not an indication that the relationship has failed. It is an indication that the people in it have assessed the situation honestly and recognized the limits of what they can provide for each other without assistance. Chapter 10. The Quiet Register Audit. The first measure in the audit addresses whether the topic can be named. Not fully analyzed, not completely resolved, not approached without any discomfort. Named. Can both people, in a moment of relative calm, acknowledge that the subject exists and refer to it directly, without the conversation immediately moving to a dangerous place? The ability to name a subject without that naming constituting a declaration of war is the minimum condition for repair to be possible. When a subject cannot be named at all, when even an oblique reference to it produces defensive escalation or immediate deflection, the audit has located the first significant finding. The second measure concerns whether each person's experience can be heard. This is a measure of responsiveness rather than agreement. Two people can hear each other's experience of the same event and arrive at different conclusions about it. and both of those things can happen simultaneously. What the measure asks is whether, when one person offers their account of how the rupture affected them, the other person can receive that account without immediately contesting it, redirecting to their own experience, or withdrawing. Responsiveness means that the other person's reality makes contact. Agreement is a different and much larger question. Whether behavior has changed in the area linked to the rupture is the third measure, and it is the one most resistant to the distortions of mood, atmosphere, and good intention. Behavioral change is observable in a way that relational intention is not. The question is not whether the person has stated an intention to change, it is whether the relevant behavior is different in situations that resemble the original vulnerability. Sustained behavioral change across multiple relevant situations over a meaningful period of time is the evidence this measure requires. Warmth and curiosity are the fourth measure, and they may be the most difficult to assess because they are the most subjective. Warmth here does not mean the performance of affection. It means the genuine impulse toward the other person that was present before the rupture. The desire to share something, the pleasure in their presence, the interest in their experience as a person rather than as a logistical counterpart. Curiosity means the genuine impulse to know how they are experiencing their life, not in the anxious way of a person monitoring potential threat, but in the interested way of someone who considers the other person's inner experience worth knowing. Whether fear is controlling speech is the fifth measure, and it requires honest self-assessment. A person who edits their communication primarily to manage the other person's reaction, rather than to be clear and kind, is operating under a form of fear. The edit may be subtle, a subject omitted, a concern softened beyond recognition, a reaction suppressed and replaced with a more acceptable one. The question is whether the editing is being done out of consideration and genuine desire for productive communication, or out of the learned understanding that certain communications will produce responses too costly to manage. Whether trust is increasing is the sixth measure, and it is assessed by looking at the direction of movement rather than the absolute state. Trust does not return in a single moment, but across time, it tends to move in a detectable direction. Is the injured person discovering that they can rely on the changed conduct across more situations than before? Are they finding that the relationship can hold more honest exchange than it could 3 months ago? The trajectory, even when it is slow and uneven, is the information this measure extracts. The forbidden subject test begins with the requirement to state the subject neutrally, not as an accusation, not as a verdict, but as a description of the specific area of the rupture. If the rupture concerns financial decisions made unilaterally, the neutral statement might be something like, "I want to talk about how we handle significant financial decisions together." If it concerns a broken confidence, the neutral statement names that specific subject without immediately assigning blame for the past instance. The neutrality of the opening is not about concealing the difficulty. It is about creating enough space for the conversation to begin before it escalates. What happens next is observational. The test does not require the conversation to succeed. It requires that both people notice what occurs when the subject is approached. Does the conversation remain possible? Does the other person acknowledge the subject and engage with it, even if imperfectly and with some visible discomfort? Or does the naming itself produce an immediate response that closes the conversation before it can begin? A sharp escalation, a withdrawal, a redirection to a different subject, a declaration that this conversation is not happening today. Defensiveness observed during this test requires careful interpretation. Some degree of defensiveness in response to a subject linked to a rupture is expected and does not automatically indicate the absence of repair. A person who responds with some defensiveness and then finds their way back to engagement, who manages the defensiveness and continues the conversation, is demonstrating a capacity that matters more than the absence of defensiveness altogether. Defensiveness that is modulated is different from defensiveness that terminates the conversation. Retaliation, dismissal, or withdrawal in response to a neutral naming of the subject are more significant findings. Retaliation means that naming the subject produces a counter-offensive rather than engagement. Dismissal means that the subject is treated as having no legitimate standing in the conversation. Withdrawal means that the person physically or emotionally exits the conversation entirely in response to the naming. Each of these responses delivers information about the current state of the forbidden territory, and each belongs in the register as a data point rather than as a verdict. Safety must be assessed before the test is conducted rather than after it. If previous attempts to name a difficult subject resulted in escalating hostility, severe emotional pressure, or consequences that the person found harmful, the forbidden subject test, as described here, may not be the appropriate next step. In those cases, the presence of a third person with appropriate professional training or a different setting with different conditions may be required before honest engagement is possible. The register is a diagnostic tool, not a mandate for entry into territory where the conditions of safety are genuinely uncertain. There is a subject in the relationship you know or the relationships you know that has become forbidden. You may have a clear name for it. You may know it only as the topic that cannot be approached directly. Either way, it is worth noting it privately, for yourself, without any immediate obligation to act on that noting. Simply acknowledging its existence, naming what it is in a space where you are the only audience, is the beginning of honest accounting. That private naming belongs to you, not to any public reckoning, and the register asks only that you be honest with yourself about what the subject is and what its inaccessibility has cost. Chapter 11. Speaking without recreating the war. One of the consistent features of relational conversations that escalate rapidly is that they begin too broadly. Two people enter a conversation that was supposed to be about a specific subject and find themselves within minutes navigating the history of the entire relationship, relitigating instances from 3 years ago, contesting the validity of each other's general patterns, and producing a degree of historical overload that makes any particular resolution impossible. The conversation cannot be resolved because its scope has grown to include everything, and everything cannot be resolved in a single conversation. Choosing a specific subject before beginning is not a reduction of the conversation's importance. It is the condition under which the conversation can actually accomplish something. Stating a purpose is the complement to choosing a specific subject. The purpose is not winning. It is not establishing who was right. The purpose is either to understand something about the other person's experience, to share something about one's own experience, to determine whether repair is occurring, or to decide on a specific change in how the relationship operates going forward. A purpose that can be stated in one sentence is a purpose that can potentially be fulfilled in a single conversation. A conversation without a stated purpose tends to expand toward the full scope of the relationship's difficulty, which is a scope that cannot be fulfilled and that makes escalation almost inevitable. Setting a time boundary on a difficult conversation serves a function that may not be obvious. Not all relational processing can or should be completed in a single session, and establishing in advance that the conversation will be concluded at a specific point, or that it will not continue past a certain level of intensity, reduces the pressure on both people to resolve everything immediately or to prevent the conversation from ending prematurely by escalating to keep it alive. A conversation that can be ended and resumed is more likely to produce useful information than one in which both people feel that everything must be said before the other person is able to close it. Historical overload is one of the most consistent barriers to productive relational conversation, and it tends to enter through two routes. The first is the habit of introducing past instances when the current discussion becomes uncomfortable, as a way of shifting the balance of the conversation or establishing context that feels necessary. The second is the pattern of using a current conversation as the occasion to raise every accumulated grievance that has not been addressed individually. Both routes are understandable, and both prevent the specific conversation from reaching resolution. The discipline of limiting the conversation to the specific subject chosen at the beginning is not about ignoring history. It is about creating the conditions under which one specific part of the history can be addressed adequately. What would count as progress for this particular conversation is worth defining before the conversation begins. Not resolution, not full understanding, not the restoration of trust. Progress for a single conversation about a specific subject might be that both people's accounts of the subject, were heard without immediate dismissal, or that a specific piece of information was shared and received, or that both people agreed on what the next conversation would address. Small, achievable definitions of progress prevent the conversation from failing by the standard of a transformation it was never capable of delivering. Beginning from the observable level means naming specific behavior rather than general character. A general characterization of a person, such as describing them as unreliable or dismissive, offers very little the other person can engage with usefully. They can accept or contest the characterization, and either response moves the conversation away from the specific event and toward a negotiation about identity. A specific behavior, such as naming the instance when a particular commitment was not kept, or describing a specific conversation in which a concern was not acknowledged, gives both people a shared reference point that is more resistant to pure contestation and more amenable to honest examination. Naming the impact follows from naming the behavior. What changed for you when this happened? What did you find yourself carrying as a result? Not a verdict about the other person's intention, but an account of what the experience produced. The impact is yours to name. The other person's intention is theirs to name. When both are named without one being used to cancel the other, the conversation has more information available to it than it does when impact and intention are collapsed into a single contested point. The unresolved relational meaning beneath the specific behavior is often what the conversation ultimately needs to reach. A conversation that stays at the level of behavior and impact will accomplish something. A conversation that can move from the specific behavior to the question about reliability or loyalty or safety that the behavior raised will accomplish something more. Making the relational meaning explicit is a risk because it raises the stakes of the conversation significantly. It is also the move that creates the possibility of genuine repair because it addresses the level at which the rupture actually occurred. Asking for the other person's perspective is not a rhetorical gesture. It is a genuine request for information that the conversation cannot provide without their active participation. What did this look like from where you were? What was your experience of the same period? The question has to be genuine in the sense that the asker is actually willing to receive an answer that differs significantly from their own account. An invitation to share a perspective that is immediately contested when it arrives is an invitation in form only. Avoiding certainty about the other person's motives is a discipline that distinguishes useful relational conversation from relational prosecution. Motive is interior, it is not directly observable. A person who describes another's motives with confidence, who explains why the other person did what they did in terms that leave no room for the other person's own account, has constructed a narrative that may be plausible but is not verified. Staying with observable behavior and named impact rather than imputed motive keeps the conversation within territory where information can actually flow between two people. Ending a conversation before escalation destroys the information it contains is a specific skill worth developing. When a conversation reaches the threshold at which both people are no longer exchanging information but are exchanging escalating responses to each other's escalating responses, very little of value is being produced. Knowing what that threshold feels like personally and having an agreement with the other person about how the conversation is paused when it reaches that point preserves the possibility of returning to it productively. A conversation that was ended before it destroyed what it had accumulated can be resumed. A conversation that ran past its useful point often leaves damage that makes the subject harder to approach next time. Chapter 12. What real repair looks like. The most reliable sign that genuine repair is occurring is the return of access to previously dangerous territory. Not access without discomfort, not access without any residual tenderness around the subject, but access in the sense that the subject can be entered and the conversation can be sustained. A topic that generated months of conflict and that can now be raised directly, heard by both people and discussed without immediate escalation, has changed its status in the relationship. That change in status is evidence that something has been repaired, even if the repair is incomplete. Questions begin to replace assumptions when access returns. Instead of predicting what the other person would say about a particular decision and proceeding on that prediction, a person with returning access finds themselves genuinely curious about the other person's view and willing to ask for it. The shift from prediction to question is small in behavioral terms and significant in relational terms. It means that the other person's actual perspective has been restored to relevance, that their input is being sought rather than estimated, that they are being treated as present rather than managed around. Defensive interruption, the reflexive response that cuts off the other person's statement before it can fully land, decreases as repair progresses. This does not mean defensiveness disappears. Conversations about subjects connected to serious ruptures typically contain some defensiveness for a long time. What changes is whether the defensiveness terminates the conversation or whether both people can work through it and continue. Two people who can sit with a brief episode of defensiveness, acknowledge it without weaponizing it, and return to the subject they were discussing have developed a relational capacity that was probably not present during the conflict period. When emotional information begins to return, the relationship has moved beyond the logistical. A person sharing something genuinely felt, something uncertain or difficult or significant about their inner experience in the shared space of the relationship is demonstrating a degree of trust that was probably not available during the period of avoidance. The return of emotional disclosure is gradual and often uneven. It tends to begin with subjects adjacent to the rupture before it extends to the rupture itself. Each instance of disclosure that is received without dismissal or retaliation constitutes evidence that the space is becoming safer. The relational bond surviving a genuine disagreement without damage to its fundamental structure is evidence of a specific kind of repair. Two people who repaired a serious rupture and then, some months later, found themselves in honest disagreement about something unrelated and managed that disagreement without the relationship contracting around it, have demonstrated that the repair extended to the underlying relational architecture rather than just the surface behavior. The ability to disagree without the relationship returning to its worst states is not a minor achievement. Warmth that does not require pretending the rupture did not occur is qualitatively different from warmth that depends on the rupture's invisibility. A relationship that can hold warmth and history simultaneously, that can be genuine in its affection without requiring that a painful period be erased from the shared account of what this relationship has been, has repaired at a depth that reaches the relationship's self-understanding. Both people know what happened. Both people are still genuinely present to each other. That combination is among the more meaningful signs that the repair was real. The connection between what a person says they will do and what they subsequently do, observed across multiple situations over a meaningful period, is the evidence on which reliability is assessed. Not the declaration, not the intention, the observable correspondence between commitment and conduct. When that correspondence holds consistently in situations related to the rupture, which is to say in situations that resemble the vulnerability that the rupture exposed, the relationship has evidence of changed reliability rather than changed language. Repetition over time is what distinguishes evidence from performance. A single instance of changed behavior after a repair conversation is information but insufficient. The same behavior repeated in 3 subsequent similar situations begins to look like a pattern. The same behavior repeated across an extended period, including in situations of stress where the old pattern would have asserted itself, constitutes evidence strong enough to revise expectations. The time required for this accumulation is not a punishment. It is the irreducible structure of how trust is rebuilt. Setbacks within the repair process are common and do not necessarily indicate that the repair has failed. A person who has genuinely changed their conduct in relevant areas may encounter a situation of unusual pressure and respond in that situation in a way that resembles the old pattern. What matters is what follows. If the setback is acknowledged, named specifically, and the changed conduct resumes, the setback has been incorporated into the repair process rather than ending it. If the setback is minimized, contested, or followed by a period in which the repair behavior disappears, the setback has revealed something about the durability of the change. Distinguishing an isolated effort from a pattern change requires patience with ambiguity. Some people, following a repair conversation, make a genuine effort that is sustained for a period and then gradually declines as the emotional salience of the repair conversation fades. This is not the same as deliberate reversal. It is evidence that the change required more structural support than was available, or that the conversation alone was insufficient to produce lasting behavioral reorganization. The distinction between isolated effort and pattern change does not emerge until a period long enough has passed for both to be possible. Demanding identical healing speed from both people is one of the common errors in repair. Two people who experienced the same rupture from different positions, one as the person whose conduct caused the harm, and one as the person who received it, are not starting the repair process from the same place. The person who caused harm may feel that the apology was sincere and the changed conduct is genuine, and experience genuine frustration that the other person's trust has not kept pace with those facts. The person who received harm is operating on the evidence of their experience, which includes not only the recent change but the pattern that preceded it. These different positions produce different healing speeds, and the difference is not evidence of bad faith. When both people are investing in the repair, the relationship's overall trajectory tends to be detectable even when individual moments remain difficult. Investment means both people are willing to enter the difficult conversations. Both are willing to sit with discomfort rather than immediately routing around it, and both are making the relational honesty a priority alongside the practical management of the shared life. When only one person is investing, the dynamic changes significantly, and the question that follows is the one that the next section addresses. Chapter 13. When only one person repairs. Identifying personal responsibility in a rupture is a discipline that must be practiced regardless of whether the other person is engaged in the same discipline. It is tempting to defer the accounting of one's own conduct until the other person has completed theirs, or to limit the acknowledgement of personal responsibility to whatever proportion seems to match the other person's acknowledgement of theirs. Both of these deferrals allow the other person's behavior to determine the quality of one's own self-examination, which is a way of remaining in the relationship's reactive mode rather than approaching it with any genuine autonomy. Changing one's own behavior in areas where it was genuinely problematic is possible without the other person's participation. A person who recognized during a period of conflict that their responses to certain situations were more damaging than helpful can change those responses, regardless of what the other person is or is not doing. That change has value on its own terms. It may also change the conditions of the relationship in ways that make the other person's engagement more likely. But the primary reason to make it is that it is the honest response to an accurate self-assessment, not a strategy for inducing the other person to reciprocate. Offering acknowledgement to the other person, even when their conduct was more responsible for the rupture, even when the apology feels disproportionate, is a choice about honesty rather than fairness. If one's own conduct during the conflict period included things that were dismissive, retaliatory, or harmful to the other person, those things belong in the acknowledgement regardless of the larger context that produced them. Acknowledgement of one's own conduct does not require endorsing the other person's behavior or removing their responsibility. It requires only an honest accounting of what one actually did. Setting limits on what one is willing to continue accepting, how one is willing to be treated, what relational conditions are acceptable and what are not, is a form of personal responsibility rather than merely a defensive maneuver. Limits defined clearly and honestly give both people accurate information about what the relationship requires to continue and what will change if those requirements are not met. A limit stated privately and never communicated is a resentment. A limit stated clearly is a piece of relational information that the other person can choose to respond to or not. Using the other person's failure to avoid one's own work is a specific pattern worth naming. It appears when a person focuses exclusively on what the other person has not done, as a way of not examining what they themselves have done or could do. The two things are not mutually exclusive. What the other person owes the relationship is their business. What one owes the relationship is one's own. A person who has genuine repair work to do on their side of the register does not escape that work by pointing to the larger failure on the other side. The register belongs to both people, and each side requires honest maintenance. When genuine repair efforts on one side are consistently met with refusal, non-response, or minimal engagement from the other, the question of what is possible without reciprocity becomes unavoidable. A person can change their own conduct, they can offer acknowledgement, they can create conditions more conducive to honest conversation. They cannot, through their own efforts alone, create the mutual exchange that constitutes genuine relational repair. Repair is not a unilateral achievement. It requires two people who are both willing to engage honestly with the rupture and with each other. The distinction between slow repair and absent repair is significant and requires time to distinguish reliably. A person who is capable of repair but is moving through it at a pace that feels frustratingly slow is different from a person who is not engaging with the repair at all. The former requires patience and continued honest conversation. The latter requires a different assessment. The difference between slowness and absence becomes visible when the direction of movement, however slow, is examined. Slow repair tends to move, even fitfully, toward greater access, greater acknowledgement, and greater behavioral consistency. Absent repair tends to hold still or regress when conditions become more demanding. Capacity and safety are always relevant considerations. A person who is not engaging with the repair process may lack the internal resources, skills, or relational experience to engage with it in the way the situation requires. They may be managing something in their own life that leaves nothing available for the relational repair work. They may have had experiences that make certain kinds of relational conversation feel genuinely overwhelming. None of these considerations remove the practical reality that the repair requires their participation, but they shape the response, distinguishing between encouraging the person to access support and concluding that the repair is simply not something they will choose to pursue. The recognition that sincerity cannot manufacture reciprocity is a specific and difficult form of clarity. A person who has repaired their own conduct sincerely, offered acknowledgement genuinely, and created conditions for honest conversation patiently cannot produce the other person's willingness to engage. That willingness belongs to the other person. It is not something that can be achieved through greater patience, more perfect communication, or more complete acknowledgement. When the other person's engagement is genuinely absent across a sustained period, this recognition that the limit of unilateral effort has been reached is not a verdict. It is accurate information. Gathering support during this period is a practical response to a situation that carries significant weight. Not necessarily to report the relationship's difficulties to others, but to maintain one's own resources, perspective, and honest self-assessment with the assistance of people who can hold the situation with care. A therapist, a trusted person with relevant experience, or a structured support can provide the kind of reflective holding that makes it possible to remain honest about the situation without either abandoning the repair effort prematurely or continuing it past the point where evidence supports it. Evaluating the form of the relationship in light of evidence about the repair is the appropriate response to sustained asymmetry. What does this relationship actually consist of, given what the repair has and has not produced? Is the current form of the relationship one that both people can sustain honestly? Is there a different form involving changed expectations, changed access, or a changed role for each person in the other's life that would be more honest than the current one? These questions belong to the next section of the register, which addresses not only whether repair is occurring, but what comes next when the evidence has been examined. Final chapter: Repair, redesign, or end. Continued repair means that both people are engaging honestly with the rupture, that conduct has changed in relevant areas, that trust is building through evidence, and that the relationship is moving toward a condition in which honest exchange is possible and valued. This outcome preserves the bond in its existing form with changed conduct and does not require that the difficulty be forgotten or that the repair be complete. Repair, honestly continued, is not a return to the relationship's pre-rupture state. It is the relationship as it exists now, carrying the history honestly, with both people committed to the changed conduct that the history revealed as necessary. Relational redesign is a different outcome, and it is distinct both from repair and from ending. Redesign means that the structure of the relationship changes in a way that makes honest existence within it more sustainable for both people. A marriage that redesigns may involve changed expectations about emotional disclosure, changed boundaries around financial decisions, changed roles within the household, or changed access to certain areas of each person's life. A friendship that redesigns may involve reduced frequency of contact, different topics that are and are not part of the relationship, or a changed level of mutual dependency. A professional alliance that redesigns may involve clearer boundaries around what belongs to the shared work and what does not. Ending or creating significant distance is a legitimate outcome when the evidence indicates that the relationship in any meaningful form cannot support truth, safety, or honest engagement. This is not failure by default, and it is not liberation by default. It is a response to evidence. A relationship whose silence cannot be broken honestly without creating conditions of harm, or whose repair requires that one person consistently abandon their own honest account of their experience, may have reached the limit of what its current structure can provide. The decision to end a relationship, or to change it to a form that involves significant distance, is appropriately made on the basis of evidence rather than emotional temperature. Matching each outcome to its evidence requires that the evidence be examined honestly rather than in service of the outcome that feels most comfortable. The evidence for continued repair includes mutual engagement, behavioral change, and the return of access. The evidence for redesign includes partial repair, persistent limitations in certain areas, and both people's recognition that a changed structure would allow honest existence that the current structure cannot. The evidence for ending includes sustained absence of repair, conditions that prevent honest engagement, or safety concerns that the relationship's current structure creates rather than addresses. Practical consequences belong in the assessment and should not be set aside in the interest of appearing clear-minded. A relationship with significant financial entanglement, shared dependence, or long-term legal or practical commitments carries practical consequences for any structural decision that must be acknowledged honestly. These consequences do not determine the outcome. They belong in the full accounting. A decision made without examining its practical consequences is incomplete in a way that tends to produce additional damage downstream. The register asks for honest assessment of the full situation, and the practical dimensions of the situation are part of that. Reviewing acknowledgement means asking honestly whether the person who caused the harm has genuinely received the impact of what they did, whether they named it accurately, and whether their account of it demonstrates that the injured person's experience was real to them. Not whether the apology was eloquent or emotionally moving, but whether the acknowledgement reached the level at which the rupture occurred. The presence or absence of genuine acknowledgement is the first determinant of which of the three outcomes the evidence actually supports. Reviewing changed behavior asks whether the conduct linked to the rupture is observably different across a meaningful number of relevant situations over a meaningful period of time. Behavioral change, as the register has established, is the primary evidence for repair. In its absence, apology and changed language are insufficient to rebuild the trust that behavior damaged. In its presence, even when the change is imperfect and uneven, the evidence supports at least the possibility of continued repair. Reviewing safety requires that the question be asked plainly. Is the relationship in its current form one in which both people can exist honestly without one of them carrying an unreasonable burden of harm? Safety here includes physical safety, emotional safety in the sense of not being systematically undermined, and the practical safety of being able to name the truth without severe disproportionate consequences. When this review reveals that safety is genuinely compromised, the evidence supports a different structure, regardless of what the other evidence indicates. Reciprocity in the review means examining whether both people are engaging with the repair with something approaching equivalent willingness. Not identical pace, not identical skill, but genuine mutual investment. A repair process in which one person is doing nearly all of the repair work, while the other person participates minimally or not at all, is not mutual repair. That asymmetry is information about the relationship's current condition that belongs in the review. The cost of continued silence across all the categories the register has examined belongs in the accounting. What is the relationship actually costing both people in terms of honest exchange, genuine connection, trust, and the ability to bring their real experience into the shared space? A relationship maintained at the cost of both people's access to their own honest account of their situation is maintaining a form without the substance it is supposed to contain. That cost accumulated over time is real and deserves explicit acknowledgement in the evidence review. Choosing a proportionate next step means that the action chosen corresponds to what the evidence actually indicates rather than to the most dramatic available conclusion. The evidence may support a specific conversation rather than a fundamental restructuring. It may support a period of repair with professional assistance rather than an immediate decision. It may support a clearly stated change in conditions rather than a complete ending. Proportionality in response to evidence keeps the decision within the territory of what is actually indicated rather than what is most emotionally urgent in a particular moment. The calm evening from the opening is worth returning to. The dinner is done, the television is on. Two people occupy the same space with practiced ease, saying what needs to be said about tomorrow. That scene has not changed. What the register provides is the ability to read it accurately. Is the silence restorative because something was genuinely addressed? Is it exhausted from the weight of something carried for too long? Is it fearful, managed carefully to prevent a conversation that still carries too much risk? Is it the quiet of a person who has already left while remaining present? The scene is the same. The question the register answers is what the scene contains. Epilogue, the sound of actual peace. Return to the opening scene. Two people, the quiet house, the television's light, the practiced movements through familiar rooms. Apply the 4 measures now, with everything the register has developed. Can the subject that governed 3 months of conflict be named tonight, if it needs to be? Is each person genuinely curious about how the other is experiencing their life, or are they monitoring and managing? Has the behavior that the conflict was circling changed in observable ways across the situations that resembled it? Is there warmth in the room that does not depend on the subject being buried, warmth that could coexist with the subject if it arose? The answers to these questions, examined honestly rather than in the direction of the preferred conclusion, reveal whether the silence represents something from the register's taxonomy. It may be restorative, the quiet of people who worked through something difficult and are genuinely resting in its resolution. It may be exhausted, the quiet of people who no longer have the energy to enter a subject that has not moved. It may be fearful, the quiet of someone who has learned to manage the room carefully. It may be the quiet of someone who completed their departure long before the fighting stopped. The scene looks the same. The register reads differently for each. Naming what the silence is does not automatically require changing it immediately. The audit delivers information. The response to that information belongs to the people holding it, and the response must account for everything the register examined: acknowledgement, behavioral change, safety, reciprocity, and the proportionate next step. The evening continues, as evenings do, regardless of what the silence contains. What changes with the register is whether the people in it know what they are living with, and whether that knowledge is allowed to inform what they choose to do next. The definition of peace that the register works toward is not the absence of all difficulty. It is the condition in which truth remains accessible within the relationship. Two people who have repaired a serious rupture are not people who never disagree or who find every subject easy. They are people who can bring their genuine experience into the shared space and have it received with sufficient care that the relationship does not contract around the honesty. Peace, understood this way, is not fragile in the way that false peace is. It does not depend on certain subjects being avoided. It can hold things that are uncomfortable because the structure of the relationship has been honestly maintained. Disagreement does not require the annihilation of the relationship or of either person standing within it. Two people who peace can hold are people who have demonstrated to each other through the repair process that honest conflict does not end everything. The rupture happened, the acknowledgement happened, the conduct changed, the relationship is still here. That sequence, completed honestly, constitutes evidence that the relationship can survive the truth of both people's experience. Future disagreements occur within a relationship that has already demonstrated its capacity to hold them. That demonstration is the most reliable foundation for genuine peace. The master question that opened this examination was, when the fighting stops, what evidence proves that the relationship healed rather than merely became quiet? The register's answer is not atmospheric. It is not a feeling of peace or the absence of visible conflict. The evidence is observable. Acknowledgement at the level of the actual rupture. Behavioral change in the relevant areas, sustained across situations and time. Access to previously dangerous subjects, maintained without conditions of fear. Warmth and curiosity that do not require the rupture's invisibility. Trust moving, however slowly, in the direction that changed conduct supports. The absence of these is not peace. The presence of them, even in imperfect and incomplete form, is the closest honest description of what genuine healing looks like. There is a form of quiet you have most often mistaken for peace in the relationships that have mattered to you. It may be the quiet of exhaustion, maintained because re-entry felt too costly. It may be the quiet of fear, managed carefully enough that it no longer felt like fear. It may be the quiet of emotional departure, mistaken for contentment because the logistical surface was functioning. Naming which form it has most often been, privately, without any requirement to perform the answer, is the registration that the quiet register was built for. The next examination belongs to a different register, one concerned with the roles that people carry in relationships and in communities, and with the editing that those roles perform on what a person can honestly admit about their own experience. When you learn which subjects your social roles have made inadmissible and which parts of your account of your own life those roles have systematically excluded, you encounter a different kind of silence, not the silence between two people, but the silence within one. That examination is what the Role Keeper's Index is for.